Off the record. Viruses are something that we look at rather unfavorably, something that nowadays is viewed this way more than ever. But the reality is, viruses are a part of our very being, as 8% of our genetic coding is actually composed of ancient viruses. This remnants exists as the virus itself was transcribed back into our DNA in order for it to be expressed over time as our cells divide and even new life being brought into the world. With this in mind, typically what happens with viruses that are stored within our genetic coding, they can be expressed sporadically and build more versions of itself over time. However, what we typically don't see is the changing of the physiology of the human body. Enter SCP-742, a Keter class SCP that can sidestep the human immune system to give itself free reign, but then also change critical components of the body in order to give itself the best chance at being passed along to the next Homo sapiens.
Item number: SCP-742. Object class: Keter. Special containment procedures. Instances of SCP-742-1 are kept in solitary confinement cells in the maximum security wing off-site and are fed kilograms of freshly harvested human bone marrow obtained in addition to standard humanoid-grade rations. Samples of SCP-742 virus itself are kept in a secure vault at Site-19. Personnel are to note that while infected individuals are extremely dangerous, SCP-742 itself has an exceedingly low infectivity except when injected directly into the bloodstream, and it's not considered a biohazard. Mobile Task Force has been created to respond to the uncontained outbreaks of SCP-742 and are currently in the field in...
The virus is of great concern for the Foundation, as should it escape the confines of security, well, then humanity is pretty much screwed. Despite it not spreading very fast, say like in comparison to something like a respiratory disease, the reality is it is able to move through a population by conversion of humans to something else. However, for it to be properly activated, certain patterns must happen in order for it to activate within the human body. The log mentions this process, so let's take a look at this and discuss what the virus is and how it ultimately achieves what it sets out to do.
Description: SCP-742 is a retrovirus approximately times more complex than any known naturally occurring virus. SCP-742 infects all cell types, but initially only enters the lytic cycle of helper T cells, leading to a state of immunocompromisation that allows for SCP-742 to infect every one of the infected subject cells. Infected cells secrete hormones that increase appetite, as well as a signal compound. Once full infection is achieved, concentration of this signal compound reaches a target level and the infection enters stage 2.
There exists under the ice currently being melted right now, so strap in for this one, absolutely massive viruses. These megaviruses, as they are being referred to, are essentially causing some concern to scientists that are finding them. Now, a virus that is larger than others doesn't necessarily mean it's a larger threat to humanity as a whole, because the size of a virus really doesn't equate to infectivity or severity. It does, however, show that over time, entire versions of viruses have seemingly disappeared and are now reappearing as they're being released from the ice. SCP-742, for all intents and purposes, could be one of these lost viruses. However, unlike the megaviruses that we are finding underneath the ice right now, those may or may not be infectious to humanity. Sort of like why a tree that has Dutch elm's disease can't spread to animals. It's relying on certain markers on the cellular surface, and as a result, should the cell lack this, it makes it difficult for the virus to even enter a cell and thrive. The virus would just be scooped up by macrophages and destroyed. My favorite example to kind of explain this is the Delta 32 allele mutation. During the bubonic plague back in the Middle Ages, it's hypothesized that roughly 1/3 to 2/3 of Europe fell to a bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. This ultimately left those that were living either extremely lucky or possessing something that kept them alive. We know with the Central Europeans, there is a mutation that allows them to survive the bacterial infection, and this was a mutation in the Delta 32 allele. On CD4 and CD8 T cells exists a marker that HIV needs to latch onto in order to be brought into the cell and begin infecting the body. This mutation in the Central Europeans had this marker either not presenting well on the cellular surface or made it absent entirely. This mutation effectively makes people very resistant to HIV infections, and it's not capable of propagating within the body if it can't get within the T cells, or at least it has a more difficult time propagating. It should be known that HIV does have a high mutation rate, and other ways have been found for the virus to bypass this protection, because HIV is honestly just a complete loser. T cells are a critical component to our immune systems to function properly, which is what makes HIV so terrible, as it destroys these cells, of which SCP-742 shares a lot of similarities. Having entered T cells in the body, body, the point would be reproduction of itself. Much like the other viral invasions, this leads to the cell bursting once it has been filled to the brim with these viruses and thus being destroyed. With no T cells to stave off infection, this leads to them being immunocompromised, which means other more opportunistic infections could take place and then destroy the body. However, this would also suggest that something may be going on with SCP-742 itself. I didn't just bring up the human immunodeficiency virus for funsies. It shares a lot of similar patterns with this virus, but once HIV has progressed to the point of the immune system being compromised, this leads to something known as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. With this part of the immune system effectively destroyed, at this point any disease is free to ransack your body that normally you'd have no problem putting down. With SCP-742, this does not appear to happen, so this would suggest that an actual functioning of the T cells may just be altered and then basically just changed their functionality, but under the direct orders of the virus itself. And as we will learn later in this log, the virus writes itself into the coding of a person and begins altering cellular behavior quite readily. We see more of this when the second stage of the infection begins to take hold.
Description continued. During stage 2 of SCP-742, effects to the nervous system causes the infected subject to ravenously consume large quantities of protein-rich food and then seek out a dark, secluded area, often a cave, abandoned building, or crypt. At this point, the subject enters a state of hibernation, slowing the metabolism down to the point of apparent death. During this period of SCP-742's retrovirus will completely reverse transcribe itself into the infected subject's DNA and deactivates its viral properties. Following the event, the subject is designated as SCP-742-1.
So we see that the cells after being infected will release a hormone that increases appetite of the host, but I believe it's a two-pronged attack. First thing that we need to note is that the body at this point would need to be absolutely saturated with the virus. The T cells were simply attacked first as not to hinder the later virus production. T cells have many different forms, but one of them is known as a natural killer T cell, which will go out and find cells that are presenting viral particles on their surface. They will then order the cell to undergo apoptosis or release cytotoxic materials to destroy it if it won't go quietly. Other T cells, such as the helper T cells, will present destroyed viruses to B cells, and upon finding the right B cell, cause them to release antibodies. And this is the one that SCP-742 prefers to attack first. What's interesting is, though, then this is really why, the B cells have an answer to every known virus and unknown virus, meaning that likely there is a B cell capable of fighting SCP-742, and should it be activated, this could cause issues for its spreading. The virus, considering its complexity, means that it may understand to a degree this entire process, and this is the reasoning of why the T cells are attacked first, to stop the cascade before it even begins. Once saturating the body, the stomach cells would be targeted. Here, the cells would be altered and then release a hormone known as ghrelin. Ghrelin tells your brain that you are hungry and that it's time to eat. Normally, it's released during a time of hypoglycemia or when you haven't eaten in a while. However, this would be produced and probably overproduced in those infected with SCP-742, and this caused them to basically become completely ravenous as they need to begin cultivating mass. The second thing that likely it attacks is the pancreas. Here is where insulin would be released into the bloodstream by the cells, which would then cause glucose to enter the cells because it's about to get a whole lot more energy exerted than here. And this causes the infected to seek out the food and then hide. And this is where the body starts getting slowed down. Again, considering the virus has saturated the entire meat suit, it now affects the actual brain of a person, causing the metabolism to slow down while the food is digested. Again, because changes to the body are coming.
Description continued. Newly created instances of SCP-742-1 use the food energy ingested during the viral phase to alter their physiology, resulting in an organism superficially similar to a human, but with a second alimentary tract linked roof of the mouth, several new organs of indeterminate function, and a subtly altered nervous system. Once fully transformed, instances of SCP-742-1 continue to function as if they were normal human beings and are virtually indistinguishable without medical examination. However, SCP-742 infection destabilizes the genome during reverse transcription, leading to symptoms consistent with telomerase dysfunction within approximately a month.
So here's what's interesting about all of this. The whole monologue I went on before about the actual viral coding within our DNA may have implications for life as we know it itself. I mentioned it before, but there is this idea that multicellular life may have been started because of viruses. I mean, viruses have been Shrek single-celled organisms since day one, and this microscopic war ultimately resulted in some virus probably invading a cell and imprinting on its genetic coding. After doing so, this changed the behavior of that cell, and this cell may have gone on to invade another cell, which may actually be where we get the mitochondria, but there is another implication: sexual reproduction. We think it's pretty standard, but really think about how a sperm cell enters an egg cell. It is quite literally a cell invading another cell, and it's not like this was discussed as a prior arrangement, it's just what a cell does. So with this idea that viruses may have changed cellular behavior in the past, we can see SCP-742 takes a similar route with this function. Upon a person being infected, their literal cellular function will begin to change. Remember, at this point, the virus has inserted itself into the actual genetic coding of the host, and now when this is read, it will cause the cell to behave in that manner and likely cease its original functionality. Because of this, we see that an entire new gastric system pops up, but this new system may be used for a different form of nutrition, which is discussed when the idea of how SCP-742 is talked about, or even how it survives. It is apparent, however, this new digestive system will act in a different manner than that of the original one. Coupled with this, the changing of cells in general may be expected. Think of it this way: in every cell that you have the same genetic coding. Well, the same genetic coding apart from your sex cells. This means that the capability of your cell to be a muscle cell or a neuron or a skin cell all exists within one single cell. However, due to the differentiation, your cell is not trying to be every cell, but really just perform its one job. After the introduction of SCP-742, it would appear that this job is changed, and as a result, cells in a certain area would change function and then form new organs. It is still your original cell, but they just now have been clustered together to form these new organs with the purpose of keeping the host alive and likely the production of new viruses. The issue is, however, as mentioned, this can lead to problems with the genetic coding itself. DNA, after all, is basically just an instruction booklet. Should the instructions be lost or damaged, then the cell no longer has any idea what to do. And that's the issue with the virus writing itself into the coding anyways. It can insert itself likely into important genes and essentially break that gene. However, with the many instructions coming from this virus on how to change, this essentially causes the genetic coding to become unstable, and likely many genes are broken in the process. I'd also go as far as to say, as the virus comes with its own ability to interact with DNA, I mean, clearly, right? But this allows for it to make changes from just inserting itself into the coding, which we will see that must be happening based on how it survives.
Description continued. SCP-742-1 can prevent this by ingesting human stem cells. In the wild, SCP-742-1 are nocturnal hunters preying on isolated humans. The victim is first paralyzed by a venomous bite and then drained of bone marrow via... Occasionally, some of the victim's flesh will also be cannibalized for sustenance. Instances of SCP-742-1 do not age normally, and if kept supplied with stem cells, are biologically immortal. Instances of SCP-742-1 specifically target younger victims because of the higher volumes of stem cells that can be obtained. Children who still have baby teeth will be found with their teeth missing. In addition, instances of SCP-742-1 will also target pregnant mothers in order to enter an infectious state. Normally, SCP-742-1 uses a pluripotent stem cell from the bone marrow to regenerate itself and is capable of spreading the SCP-742 infection. However, after ingesting at least grams of totipotent stem cells, typically from a human fetus, although the source is irrelevant, SCP-742-1 creates a small amount of fluid filled with SCP-742 retrovirus from the glands. This fluid injected major artery of a human victim is the primary transmission vector for the SCP-742 infection. Instances of SCP-742-1 behave subserviently towards the instance that infected them.
The need for other human genetic coding seems to reside in two things. First, this is what necessitates the need for a second gastric system. Instead of like with our own, where nutrition is broken down and absorbed by the small intestine to the bloodstream, with this new system, it indicates that the stem cells and marrow enters this, and then the cell's genetic coding itself is taken. This would indicate that the virus itself may be actively blocking DNA polymerase actions, as well as other correction factors when it comes to the DNA, likely so that it does not get destroyed in the process. However, with these functions stopped, mutations and errors would begin to build up within the cell. The virus, being non-native to the body, may not have an original copy of this genetic coding. So by consuming others' bone marrows and stem cells, the body is sustained, but also this template could be used on the genes of the cell to keep them in order and functional. This means that the second indication is that the virus has the ability similar to that of CRISPR, where it may be able to read and insert genes instead of just cutting them apart and destroying them. This gene insertion works to a degree, but over time, it would still degrade and mean more would have to be ingested ingested, meaning that really more humans would need to be captured. Almost like a sort of hunger, but for DNA stabilization. And this brings us back to the main mode of transmission. Despite the virus really being a virus, it's actually not that infectious and actually requires it to be injected into the bloodstream of a person to become infectious. Apart from this, it would remain in a state of dormancy until the host is actively hunting for bone marrow. Upon receiving it, the fluid secreted that contains the virus appears to be a method of infection. This means that the virus must be activated by the presence of bone marrow and likely would stem from an altered version of the salivary gland in the mouth for this exact purpose. The virus mixes with the coating and then can be applied to the damaged cells, but should they also be actively binding someone, the active virus can go on to infect them, creating more subservient SCP-742-1s. So overall, stay strapped or get clapped.